You might not notice it at first, that strange moment when your attention seems to separate from your thoughts. You're there, thinking, reacting, moving, and yet something inside is quietly watching it all happen. Today, that's what we're exploring. The silent part of you that doesn't think or judge, it observes. It sends subtle signals, trying to guide you toward clarity, but most people mistake those signals for noise. The goal isn't to control it or explain it, but to finally recognize it and learn to understand what it's been trying to tell you all along. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when you notice that the one doing the noticing is not the same as the one being noticed. It can happen in the middle of a conversation, or while driving, or even while watching yourself think about something trivial. Suddenly, for a split second, you're both the actor and the audience, and that double awareness cracks something open. You realize that the you who reacts, who gets angry, excited, anxious, or hopeful, is not the same as the silent one standing just behind all that motion. The silent one doesn't comment. It doesn't rush in to fix anything. It doesn't even seem particularly interested in the story your mind is telling. It simply watches. Most people confuse this watcher with the mind itself, because we've been trained to identify with thought, the voice that names, judges, plans. We think that's who we are. But the observer doesn't speak in that language. Its presence is not made of sentences. It doesn't say, "I am here," it is here. Imagine a lake so still that it mirrors the sky perfectly. The lake doesn't choose what to reflect. It doesn't prefer sunlight over shadow. It receives whatever appears and reveals it clearly. That's the quality of the observer within you. It doesn't participate in your mental weather. It only reflects it. And here's where the confusion begins. When you try to use the thinking mind to interpret what that stillness means, the mind can't observe itself accurately, not because it's flawed, but because it's busy being the movement that the observer is watching. It's like a camera trying to photograph itself. No matter how precise the lens, it can't include its own frame. Yet you often try. You try to analyze your own silence. You turn it into theories, spiritual goals, or self-improvement plans. But every attempt to dissect it pulls you back into the stream of thought, and the observer, patient and unchanged, waits behind the noise. You can sense the difference if you pay attention to timing. The mind always reacts after something happens. The observer, on the other hand, is there before reaction begins. When you notice yourself getting irritated, the irritation is already unfolding. But there's also a quiet awareness witnessing the entire arc of that irritation, untouched by it. That witnessing is not personal. It doesn't belong to you in the way your memories or your preferences do. It doesn't take sides. It doesn't even comfort you. It just reveals. The ego, the personality made of stories and reactions, hates that neutrality because it can't use it to justify itself. The observer offers no validation, no applause, no identity. Try this. Next time you feel an emotion rise, don't name it. Don't label it as anger, sadness, or joy. Just let it exist. And simultaneously, notice that something within you is aware of that emotion happening. See if you can feel the distance between what you feel and what is aware of the feeling. That gap is not absence. It's the space where the observer resides. If you stay there for more than a few seconds, you'll feel a strange reversal. You stop being the person having the emotion and become the space in which the emotion is being noticed. It's as if the camera has turned around and the actor disappears into pure seeing. From that space, perception changes quality. Colors seem quieter yet sharper. Time slows down, or maybe you just stop measuring it. The internal commentary loses its urgency. It's not that you suppress thought. It's that thought loses the illusion of ownership. Thoughts come and go, but they no longer report to a fixed identity. This is what some call the beginning of self-observation, but even that phrase can be misleading. There is no self observing another self. There's only the act of observation itself, a movement of awareness folding back on itself without center or boundary. Many traditions have tried to name this watcher, the soul, the witness, consciousness itself. But naming doesn't bring you closer. In fact, each label can become another layer of noise, another concept that hides the simplicity of what's happening. The observer doesn't need belief to exist. It's already there before belief begins. And yet, despite its constancy, you rarely notice it. Why? Because the world trains your attention to chase what moves, the urgent, the loud, the dramatic. The observer doesn't compete for your attention. It waits in stillness beneath the swirl of thought, like a signal broadcasting on a quiet frequency. If you could hear it clearly, you might realize it has been sending the same message all along, not through words but through presence. But there's too much static right now, too many reactions, too much noise, and that's what comes next, the interference that keeps the signal from being decoded. You wake up and before you even open your eyes, the noise begins. The phone lights up, notifications pulse, unfinished thoughts rush in from yesterday. There's a hum of expectation, what needs to be answered, what needs to be fixed, what might go wrong. It's not sound exactly, it's a vibration of attention constantly pulled outward. By the time you take your first sip of coffee, your consciousness has already scattered into a dozen directions. That scattering is what drowns the signal. The observer, that quiet field behind every perception, doesn't compete with the noise. It doesn't raise its volume to win your focus. It simply keeps transmitting on a stable, subtle frequency. But the static of daily life grows so thick that you forget there was ever another station playing. Think of it as living next to a waterfall. At first, the sound overwhelms you. You can't imagine it ever fading into the background. But after a while, your nervous system adapts. It stops registering the roar. The silence becomes the stranger. The same thing happens with mental noise. It becomes the default environment. You no longer recognize how loud your inner world has become. Most of this noise isn't even yours. It's the residue of other people's voices, social feeds shaping your opinions, ads scripting your desires, algorithms predicting your moods. The constant commentary of the collective mind wraps around you like invisible static. It's not malicious, but it's relentless. And when your attention is hijacked that way, you lose the sensitivity to notice the faint pulse of the observer's signal beneath it. Noise is not only external, there's also the internal chatter, the small, ceaseless self-talk that fills every gap in silence. You replay conversations, rehearse future arguments, evaluate your worth. This loop gives you a sense of control, but it also creates a fog. In that fog, everything you perceive passes through layers of projection, comparison, and defense. You hear but not directly. You see but filtered through expectation. The observer's signal, which depends on clarity, gets buried under interpretation. You can feel the cost of this in your body. The shoulders tense, breath shortens, vision narrows. The nervous system, built for survival, stays on alert. It confuses constant stimulation with danger, and soon the static becomes physiological. That's why stillness can feel uncomfortable. When the external input stops, all the unprocessed frequencies of thought and emotion suddenly become audible. Silence feels threatening not because it's empty, but because it reveals what the noise had been covering. There's also emotional noise, the hum of unresolved feelings you've learned to ignore. Anxiety disguised as productivity. Sadness masked as sarcasm. Anger diluted into polite tension. Each suppressed emotion is like an instrument slightly out of tune, vibrating beneath the surface of your daily functioning. The observer's signal, which requires resonance to be perceived, can't pass through that dissonance cleanly. The static isn't just around you, it's within the very medium of perception itself. And yet, you try to decode the signal from within the noise. You scroll through content that promises clarity, read one more theory, seek one more insight. The irony is that each new piece of information adds another layer to the interference. It's like adjusting a radio by turning every knob at once. The result isn't understanding, it's distortion. If you pay attention, you can notice how quickly attention itself becomes fragmented. You start reading something, and before you reach the end of the paragraph, your mind has already skipped to a dozen associations. You're rarely fully in the moment you're living. This fragmentation is the true cost of noise. It breaks continuity. And the observer's signal can only be received through continuity of attention, a steady, unbroken gaze that allows perception to deepen instead of jumping. Try a small experiment. The next time you're doing something simple, washing a dish, tying your shoes, walking across a room, see how many other thoughts intrude before the action is complete. Notice how your attention splinters. You'll see how much static your mind produces even in silence. That realization is not failure, it's calibration. The moment you notice the noise, you are already closer to the one who hears beneath it. Sometimes the noise is subtle. It hides behind ambition, behind the urge to optimize yourself, even behind the desire to be more conscious. The mind will use any excuse to stay active because stillness feels like erasure to it. It fears disappearing. But the observer isn't asking the mind to vanish, only to quiet enough that the underlying signal can be noticed. There's a pattern here. Every time the noise fades, something delicate begins to emerge. It's not dramatic. It's a soft hum, like a memory of peace you can't quite place. It appears when you pause before reacting, when you linger a second longer in a moment of stillness. That's the first hint that another channel exists, always broadcasting beneath the static. The challenge is, you can't force your way to hearing it. You can't achieve silence through effort. The more you try, the more you add to the noise. Silence happens when attention stops feeding the static. When you stop reacting to every spark, the signal begins to separate from the background. And when that happens, when for a brief instant you experience that strange clarity, that gap in the internal chatter, something else becomes possible. In that gap, a presence begins to move toward you. It doesn't speak, and yet it communicates. It waits in the moments when everything else stops, and that is where the first true signal begins to appear. It rarely happens when you're trying to make it happen. The first signal doesn't arrive through meditation apps, playlists, or perfectly arranged rituals. It slips through the cracks. Those accidental pauses between one thought and the next, between the inhale and the exhale. It comes when everything that usually fills your attention suddenly stops, and for a fraction of a second, there's nothing left to hold on to. Maybe it happens late at night, when the day's noise finally dissolves and you're lying in the dark, neither fully awake nor asleep. The mind, tired of its own voice, releases its grip, and something softer begins to glow in the background of your awareness. It's not a vision, not a sound, more like the feeling of being observed by a silence that knows you completely. For an instant, you sense that something has been waiting there all along. This first signal is not a message in words. It's a change in texture. Time loosens. The usual tension behind your thoughts relaxes. You feel as if you've stepped half a step out of the stream of your own identity. The moment you notice it, it flickers, like catching a faint reflection on water before it disappears. And still you know it was real. The human nervous system is built for movement, for reaction. Silence feels unnatural at first because it deprives the mind of its usual fuel. In silence, there's nothing to fix, nothing to compare, nothing to pursue. That's why most people flee from it. They mistake the initial discomfort for emptiness, not realizing that the unease is simply the static of noise burning off. When you stay long enough, something else begins to breathe underneath, an awareness untouched by thought. It's not peace in the sentimental sense. It's more like neutrality, vast, impersonal, yet intimate. The silence doesn't console you, it exposes you. You become aware of how restless the mind truly is. You watch it jump, invent, resist. The silence holds up a mirror, and in that reflection, you see both the turbulence and the one who has never moved. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that silence has layers. At first, it's just the absence of external sound. Then, as attention stabilizes, you begin to sense an inner quiet. Not empty, but dense, as if space itself had substance. Beneath that, there's an even deeper silence where perception feels luminous, where the act of listening becomes the content itself. That's where the observer's signal starts to pulse. It doesn't come with explanation or reason. It's more like a resonance, a frequency matching between your attention and something wider than you. The mind can't interpret it because the moment you try to think about it, you lose the connection. It's similar to watching a delicate animal in the forest. The slightest movement of grasping and it vanishes. The only way to stay in contact is to remain still, not in the body, but in the intention. At first, This silence might feel like isolation. There's an instinct to escape it, to fill it with sound, to turn it into meaning. But if you resist the urge to interpret, you begin to realize that the silence isn't empty. It's listening. It's not just you being quiet. Something on the other side of that quiet is aware of you. The observer's signal is the recognition between those two silences, yours and its. There's a kind of dialogue that starts to form, but it doesn't use language. It speaks in alignment, in coherence. You begin to sense when something is off, not through logic, but through a subtle dissonance that the silence reveals. You start noticing which thoughts, choices, or interactions disturb the quiet field and which ones harmonize with it. The observer uses this felt sense, not guilt, not reward, to guide you toward greater accuracy in being. Sometimes the signal shows up through the smallest sensory moments. The way sunlight lands on a wall, the sudden awareness of your own heartbeat, the stillness after laughter fades. Ordinary scenes take on a kind of clarity that feels impossible to explain. That's because the observer doesn't use extraordinary events to reach you. It uses the pauses hidden inside the ordinary. You may have mistaken this before for coincidence. Those moments where time seems to slow and you feel slightly outside yourself, watching the scene unfold. But that's the signal testing your attention, asking, can you stay here, unmoved, without labeling what's happening? The moment you do, the frequency strengthens, the silence deepens. But this is where the real challenge begins. Once you've felt that signal even once, life begins to reveal how much noise you still generate. Every interruption, every compulsion to react becomes visible. The more you sense the silence, the more you recognize how often you run from it. And when you ignore it for too long, the signal changes tone. The silence stops whispering and begins to press against you, not to punish, but to get your attention. That pressure, that growing sense of inner discomfort, is the next stage of the dialogue. It's what happens when the observer needs to speak louder than the noise you refuse to release. At first, ignoring it seems harmless. Life goes on. You stay busy, keep your routines, meet deadlines, plan weekends. The world rewards movement, not awareness. There's no visible punishment for neglecting that quiet presence behind your thoughts. And yet, little by little, something begins to feel off, a subtle dissonance that no amount of distraction can dissolve. You notice it in small ways: a conversation that leaves an aftertaste of falseness, a success that doesn't feel like fulfillment, a restlessness that lingers even when everything seems to be fine. The observer's signal hasn't disappeared, it's just changing form. When the whisper isn't heard, it becomes pressure. When pressure isn't acknowledged, it becomes symptom. The first symptoms are rarely dramatic. They appear as fatigue that sleep doesn't cure, confusion that no amount of planning clarifies, decisions that feel strangely mechanical. The body starts to carry the tension of what the mind refuses to face. Anxiety often isn't the fear of what might happen. It's the echo of the observer trying to communicate through the only channel left open: sensation. Every time you silence that communication with more noise, more work, more entertainment, more analysis, the signal adapts. It stops trying to speak through intuition and begins to translate into friction. Patterns repeat. Relationships circle back to the same conflicts. Opportunities vanish and reappear in slightly different disguises, all carrying the same underlying message: look closer. The danger isn't that the observer abandons you. It never does. The danger is that you forget it's there and begin mistaking the feedback for misfortune. You start to believe life is happening to you rather than through you. That's when resentment grows, against others, against circumstances, even against yourself. The world feels random, untrustworthy, adversarial. But what's really happening is a misinterpretation of the signal's persistence. There's a strange mercy in the way the observer works. It won't let you drift forever. When subtle signs fail, it raises the volume. It uses what you value most in relationships, health, identity, as mirrors. If you won't listen to the soft pull of intuition, it will send louder reflections, emotional breakdowns, loss of meaning, sudden shifts that dismantle the structures built on inattention. What looks like collapse is often a forced recalibration. Ignoring the observer creates an internal split. Part of you keeps functioning in the world, performing tasks, pursuing goals. Another part, the silent witness, waits behind the curtain, untouched but increasingly distant. The gap between these two grows until you start feeling like a stranger inside your own life. You recognize your voice, but not the one speaking. You look at your reflection and sense someone watching from behind your eyes, someone you've forgotten how to meet. This disconnection is subtle but cumulative. When the inner observer is ignored long enough, perception itself dulls. You stop seeing clearly. You interpret everything through urgency, defensiveness, or repetition. What once was wonder becomes routine. What once was curiosity becomes cynicism. The mind hardens into patterns that can no longer adjust to the present moment. The signal is still there, but like light filtered through dirty glass, it loses coherence on its way through. In that dullness, life begins to feel like noise without melody, activity without meaning. People describe it as burnout, emptiness, or spiritual fatigue. But beneath all those names is one simple condition: the loss of dialogue between awareness and experience. When the observer isn't acknowledged, consciousness collapses into identification. You become the reaction instead of the one watching it. The body tries to intervene. It sends microsignals, the skipped heartbeat, the shallow breath, the sudden tension behind the eyes. These are not random malfunctions. They are physiological echoes of a deeper misalignment. When ignored, they gather momentum. The energy that should move through observation gets trapped in repetition, looping endlessly until something finally breaks. Yet even in the breaking, the observer remains untouched. Its purpose is not to punish, but to reveal. It uses discomfort as a tool of awakening. Pain, confusion, loss, these are not signs of absence, but of insistence. The observer is still sending the same message it always did: remember. And the longer it takes for that message to be decoded, the more forcefully it reappears, not to destroy but to realign. There's an old psychological truth that matches this spiritual one: what you resist will persist. The observer's language follows the same law. It speaks through the loops you refuse to see. Every repeated situation is a resent transmission, each time a little clearer, a little louder. The cycle only ends when attention meets awareness, when the noise of reaction gives way to direct seeing. If you've ever wondered why the same mistake keeps returning in different clothes, this is the reason. The signal is trying to pierce through your pattern by repeating the shape of it until recognition happens. The question isn't, why does this keep happening to me? But, what in me is being asked to see? And once that question begins to form, a shift occurs. The tension between noise and silence reaches a threshold, and something inside starts turning inward for the first time, searching not for new information, but for the origin of the signal itself. That's when the mind, tired of seeking externally, begins to suspect that what it's chasing might actually be coming from within. The moment the inner signal begins to stir, that subtle awareness behind your thoughts, the quiet pull beneath the noise, something in you immediately tries to escape it. Not consciously, not out of defiance, but through habit. You translate that unfamiliar sensation into a task. You look for someone who has already walked the path. You start researching, watching, comparing, collecting frameworks. The modern world calls this seeking, but in truth, it is avoidance disguised as progress. It feels safer to project the unknown outward. The mind would rather search for answers than face the raw space where the question was born. Looking outward gives you motion, and motion feels like control. You can study, imitate, belong to a system. You can tell yourself you're evolving. But what's really happening is displacement. The center of attention moves away from where the signal actually originates, the silent core within. There's a psychological comfort in this external chase. You get to stay busy while avoiding the stillness that started calling you in the first place. You can replace presence with language, direct experience with borrowed wisdom. The observer's signal, which was meant to invite inward attention, becomes translated into a project of self-improvement. The sacred impulse gets turned into data. You can see this pattern in how people talk about spirituality or awareness. They gather teachings like souvenirs, Quotes, rituals, affirmations, all pointing towards silence, yet all used as more noise. It's not malicious, it's mechanical. The mind treats even transcendence as a subject to master. It builds an identity around being someone who seeks. And as long as the seeker remains, the signal can't fully transmit, because the act of seeking implies distance from what is already here. There's a simple but disorienting truth at the heart of this. The observer's message cannot be imported. No teacher, no book, no philosophy can hand it to you. They can point toward it, describe its taste, draw a map. But the map is made of ink, not silence. Every external source eventually becomes another mirror reflecting your own readiness to turn inward. The more you rely on the mirror, the less you remember that the image was always coming from within you. You might notice that the external chase carries a particular emotional texture, a restless hope mixed with subtle anxiety. Each new discovery feels like it might be the one that completes the puzzle. But once the initial inspiration fades, the same unease returns. That cycle is the mind's way of keeping attention in motion, ensuring you never stand still long enough to hear the signal directly. The reason this mistake is so common is that the inward turn feels like surrender. When you stop seeking, there's no longer a role to play. The ego loses its job as translator, and for a moment it feels like falling into a void. But that void is not absence. It's the original field where the observer communicates. Silence feels empty only to the part of you that defines itself through noise. Once you endure that first fall, what seemed like darkness becomes luminous. You can recognize the difference between an external path and the internal one by how each deals with uncertainty. The outer search promises answers. It thrives on frameworks, explanations, and progress. The inner path offers none of these. It offers only awareness itself and raw, unfiltered seeing. It doesn't solve, it reveals. And that revelation can be unsettling because it removes every layer of explanation you use to feel safe. This doesn't mean teachers or knowledge are useless. They can serve as tuning forks, reminders of the frequency you're trying to hear. But the real decoding must happen in the living silence of your own attention. When you read a profound sentence and feel something stir inside you, that stirring is the signal. The words were only a trigger. The observer was speaking through your own resonance, not through the text. The longer you chase reflections outside, the dimmer the original source feels. You start mistaking echoes for guidance. But the observer's signal never truly weakens. It simply waits. Every disappointment along the external search, every moment when a new method stops working, is part of the design. It's the system collapsing, so you'll finally turn back toward what can't collapse. There's a quiet paradox in this. The harder you look, the further you get. The signal you're trying to decode has no direction, no teacher, no ritual. It's not somewhere to arrive at. It's the space in which the searching happens. You can't find it because you never lost it. You can only stop long enough to notice that it's been watching you the entire time. And once that realization begins to take root, something strange happens in daily life. Coincidences start to cluster. The same words, numbers, and patterns begin to appear around you, as if the world itself were echoing the very awareness you've started to glimpse within. It's not that reality changed, it's that the observer found a new way to speak, projecting the inner signal onto the outer screen, waiting for you to notice. There comes a point when the inner signal, tired of waiting for you to hear it in silence, starts using the external world as its language. It begins to project what you're not yet ready to face internally onto the fabric of your surroundings. What looks like coincidence is not randomness, it's resonance. The field around you starts to echo what's vibrating within you, and the observer, patient and precise, speaks through patterns too subtle to be dismissed, yet too gentle to force belief. It often begins with small repetitions, the same phrase appearing in unrelated conversations, a number sequence that keeps showing up, a song that plays at exactly the moment your thoughts turn a certain way. You notice, pause, and immediately the rational mind steps in. It's just probability, a trick of perception. But even as you dismiss it, something quieter inside you feels seen. The timing is too exact, the context too personal. You sense that reality is folding in on itself, forming a dialogue. The human mind, conditioned to separate inner from outer, struggles with this. It wants to assign cause and effect. I thought it, then it happened, or it happened, then I thought it. But the observer doesn't operate on linear causality. It works through coherence, the alignment of inner state and outer expression. When the two match, the boundaries blur, and the world mirrors consciousness back to itself. Coincidence becomes communication. Imagine reality as a fabric stretched tight. Every thought, every emotion is a vibration on that fabric. When your attention reaches a certain frequency of coherence, even for a second, it disturbs the field in a patterned way. The environment responds not as a puppet, but as a reflection, showing you what frequency you're radiating. What you call synchronicity is not the universe giving you signs. It's the observer showing you your own reflection through time and circumstance. The difficulty lies in not turning this into superstition. The observer doesn't play games of prediction or reward. The moment you start assigning meaning to every pattern, forcing the signal into the language of control, the dialogue collapses back into noise. Coincidence is not there to tell you what to do. It's there to show you what you're being. Each event is a mirror of state, not instruction. Consider a simple example. You keep meeting the same kind of person, different faces, same emotional dynamic. You think you're unlucky or magnet for a certain type. But if you look through the observer's lens, the pattern isn't random, it's feedback. The external repetition is a projection of an unresolved internal vibration. The observer is using form to reveal frequency. Until you change the frequency, not behaviorally but consciously, the same scene will replay itself in infinite disguises. The same applies to seemingly benign coincidences. You think of someone, and they text you. You're wrestling with a decision, and an unrelated conversation answers the question you hadn't spoken aloud. The observer's signal uses these convergences to draw your attention to the state beneath your thoughts, to remind you that awareness and environment are not two separate arenas. What happens out there is simply the inside, made visible through timing. When this begins to happen frequently, the first impulse is excitement. The ego feels special, chosen, part of a cosmic plot. But the observer isn't flattering you, it's training you. It's teaching you to notice coherence. The moment you inflate it into personal importance, the patterns lose clarity. They're not a reward for spiritual achievement. They're a calibration tool. Each synchronicity is a test of whether you can stay in observation without interpretation. The more you stay present with these occurrences, the subtler the signal becomes. It doesn't need to shout anymore. You begin to sense alignment, not through events but through an atmosphere, a kind of ease, a precision of timing that feels inevitable. Life starts to flow, not because it's suddenly perfect, but because resistance decreases. The observer's communication shifts from visible coincidences to invisible coherence. You no longer need the mirror once you recognize the face. Still, the mind sometimes rebels. It wants to understand why this happens, to prove or disprove it scientifically. And in truth, there's nothing mystical about it. Physics calls it resonance, psychology calls it projection, systems theory calls it feedback loops. Different languages describing the same movement, attention influencing perception until perception rearranges reality. The observer doesn't care what name you give it, only whether you're awake enough to notice the pattern before it turns into a lesson. This kind of communication deepens through humility. The moment you stop demanding meaning and start listening with neutrality, coincidences reveal tone instead of message. Some patterns feel expansive, clear, light. That's coherence. Others feel heavy, urgent, charged. That's resistance. The observer isn't telling you what's right or wrong, it's simply reflecting the harmony or friction of your current state. And once you begin to live this way, a quiet intimacy with existence develops. You no longer chase signs, you live as if the whole world were a living field of awareness. Traffic lights, fragments of conversation, even delays start to participate in your unfolding. Reality becomes responsive, conversational, alive. But this communication is delicate. It requires your attention to remain stable, free from emotional interference. Because the moment you impose your wish or fear onto the signal, coherence breaks and the reflection distorts. That distortion too has a purpose. When the signal bends and the coincidences start to feel confusing, that's the observer reminding you. You've slipped back into interpretation, into wanting to decode rather than see. And that confusion marks the threshold of the next stage, the point where the message stops being comforting and starts to expose the resistance you've been avoiding all along. The first real decoding never feels like illumination. It feels like something breaking. The moment the signal becomes clear enough to touch you directly, it doesn't arrive as peace or insight. It arrives as pressure, as unease, as an undeniable confrontation with what you've been unwilling to see. For a long time, you believed you were chasing understanding. But when understanding finally looks back at you, your first instinct is to turn away. That's because the observer doesn't send you comfort. It sends coherence. And coherence at first is painful, not because it harms, but because it shows you the fragments. The signal isn't judging. It's simply holding up a mirror of precision. It shows the gap between who you think you are and the actual vibration you're broadcasting. Seeing that gap clearly feels like exposure, like standing under light too bright for the eyes. You might experience it as emotional turbulence, sudden irritability, unexpected sadness, or an inexplicable sense of disconnection. The rational mind scrambles to find causes: stress, diet, sleep. Anything but the possibility that awareness itself has begun to reconfigure you. But that's exactly what's happening. The observer's signal, now decoded enough to register consciously, starts rewiring your perception. It's not teaching through content, it's adjusting the way you see. And that recalibration hurts because the old lenses no longer fit. There's a moment in this process that feels like betrayal. The very silence that once comforted you now feels hostile. The coincidences that used to feel magical turn confrontational, even mocking. It's as if reality has turned against you. But it hasn't. It has only stopped confirming your illusions. The field around you is mirroring back every distortion you still carry, so that nothing false can hide. What feels like abandonment is, paradoxically, intimacy. The observer trusting that you are ready to face truth without anesthetic. Discomfort is the first clear proof that decoding has begun. Before that, you were interpreting. You were gathering signs and ideas. Now the signal is no longer an idea. It's in your nervous system, in your body. You can feel it as friction between awareness and resistance. Every time you try to retreat into your old story, the new frequency pushes against it, making the familiar unbearable. That's the moment of alchemy, where avoidance burns off and the raw substance of transformation begins to show itself. You can think of this like tuning an instrument that has been slightly out of key for years. The first turns of the peg make the string groan, stretch, and threaten to snap. It's not the instrument being damaged, it's tension being corrected. The discomfort comes from precision entering a system that has learned to survive on distortion. Once the tension stabilizes, harmony becomes possible. But until then, every adjustment hurts. During this phase, many people mistake the discomfort for failure. They assume something has gone wrong with their practice, their belief, or their balance. But in truth, this is the sign that the process is working. The observer has moved from being a background presence to an active agent in your awareness. It's decoding you, stripping away what no longer resonates. You're not learning its language, it's reprogramming yours. The decoding moment has a particular signature. Honesty becomes unavoidable. You can no longer pretend that the things you tolerate don't cost you. You can no longer maintain certain relationships, certain habits, certain roles. Everything that once provided identity starts to feel artificial, like a costume you've outgrown. The discomfort isn't about losing control, it's about losing disguise. The observer demands transparency, and the more you resist, the more pressure you feel. There's also a physical component. The body, which has stored the unprocessed residue of thought and emotion, begins to discharge it. Sleep patterns change. You feel waves of energy or exhaustion for no clear reason. These are not mystical symptoms. They're the body's way of adjusting to a new baseline of awareness. Consciousness and physiology are not separate. The observer works through both. The decoding process involves every layer of you, mental, emotional, and biological. In those moments of confusion, the temptation is to look for someone to explain what's happening. But explanations can't ease this phase, because what's being dismantled is precisely your dependence on explanation. The observer doesn't want you to understand the process, it wants you to endure it consciously. Understanding is the mind's way of reclaiming control. Endurance is surrender to transformation. As this friction intensifies, you may begin to notice that the outer world starts reflecting your inner chaos more vividly. Small conflicts multiply, old patterns resurface, everything feels slightly off balance. This is not the universe punishing you, it's resonance doing its job. The more the inner field changes, the more it pulls external reality into realignment. The discomfort expands until the mismatch between who you've been and what you're becoming can no longer coexist. Something has to yield, and it will be whatever is less real. But there's an intelligence inside this turbulence. The observer never pushes beyond what awareness can hold. Each wave of discomfort is proportionate to your current capacity for truth. The pain isn't random, it's measured. It's the sound of frequency recalibrating perception. If you stay long enough without running or explaining, you begin to feel something beneath the pain. Not relief, but a quiet coherence, a kind of inner gravity forming. That coherence marks the beginning of a new phase. You start realizing that the signal is not something you translate, but something that translates you. You're no longer decoding messages, you're being rewritten by the same intelligence that sent them. And that revelation, that reversal of roles, is what the observer had been guiding you toward all along. At some point, you realize the communication you've been trying to interpret was never made of words. The observer doesn't speak through sentences, logic, or even symbols. Its messages are delivered through resonance, shifts in state, changes in tone, the subtle frequency of presence itself. You keep listening for meaning, but what it's offering is vibration. The decoding doesn't happen in your intellect. It happens in your nervous system, in the electromagnetic field of awareness that connects you to everything you perceive. Language divides experience into pieces. Vibration unites it. The observer's signal operates beneath the threshold of thought, transmitting in a form you were never taught to recognize, through coherence, dissonance, expansion, contraction. These are not metaphors, they are measurable states. When you are aligned with the observer's frequency, the body feels open, grounded, precise. When you drift away from it, you feel static, compressed, restless. The difference isn't moral, it's mechanical, like being in tune or out of tune with the instrument of reality. The challenge is that the mind only trusts what it can name. It believes understanding comes from definition. So when the observer starts speaking in vibration, the mind panics. It tries to translate the frequency into words, to classify the feeling as an idea. But in doing so, it collapses the experience into noise again. The signal is stripped of its subtlety the moment it becomes concept. You can't capture vibration with vocabulary any more than you can describe the exact taste of water. You can only feel it. To feel it means to notice the body's immediate feedback. Every encounter, every decision, every environment produces a micro-reaction in your system. A tightening or softening, a clarity or fuzziness. That is the observer's language in motion. It doesn't tell you what to think. It shows you how aligned your current state is with the deeper field of awareness. Most people override this guidance with habit or fear, numbing themselves with thought before the vibration can register. But once you learn to listen with your entire being, the signal becomes unmistakable. You can experience this most clearly in silence. When you sit without agenda, without trying to reach anything, attention begins to stabilize. In that stillness, subtle fluctuations in feeling become visible, as if reality were breathing through you. These are not emotions in the psychological sense. They are tonal shifts, like the difference between two musical notes. One feels discordant, another harmonious. The observer is the one perceiving that tonal field. The question is whether you can remain present enough to sense it before the mind labels it. Vibration is the bridge between consciousness and matter. Modern science might call it frequency entrainment or field coherence, but those are just technical names for what mystics have always described experientially. When awareness becomes steady, it organizes energy around it. The observer doesn't impose order, it radiates coherence and the environment synchronizes accordingly. This is why clarity feels powerful, not because you're manifesting, but because you're stabilizing the field through resonance. At the same time, this vibrational language can be uncomfortable because it reveals every inconsistency instantly. When you speak or act out of alignment, you feel the static immediately, a subtle dissonance that no justification can erase. The observer's communication is uncompromising in that way. It won't punish you, but it won't let you lie to yourself either. It simply reflects frequency with precision. Every reaction in your body, every emotional tone, is feedback from that reflection. The more attuned you become, the more ordinary moments start to carry information. A stranger's glance, the hum of a refrigerator, a sudden chill in the air, all part of the same vibrational ecosystem. The observer doesn't differentiate between sacred and mundane. Everything is a carrier wave for awareness. What changes is your sensitivity. When perception becomes quiet enough, even the smallest resonance can convey more meaning than pages of text. You may begin to sense that vibration has intelligence. It arranges your path without narration. You find yourself taking a different route home, and an unexpected meeting happens. You pause before speaking, and the silence itself alters the outcome of the conversation. These are not coincidences, they are micro-adjustments orchestrated by coherence. The observer doesn't decide, it harmonizes. It uses vibration as navigation, not command. To communicate with it, you must unlearn the reflex of interpretation. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" begin to ask, "What does this feel like in my entire field?" Not emotionally, but energetically. Does it open or contract? Does it accelerate or steady you? These are the words of the observer translated into physical language. It's not mystical, it's sensory literacy. Awareness of your own frequency response to reality. The deeper you listen, the less separation remains between the signal and the one receiving it. You start noticing that your state is the message. Every time you realign with presence, the world rearranges to match that vibration. There's no longer you decoding it. There is only the continuous dialogue of energy finding coherence with itself. And when that realization stabilizes, something profound happens. The illusion of translating the observer's message fades. The process reverses. You understand that you were never decoding the observer. It was decoding you. Every vibration, every resonance, every moment of discomfort has been part of its way of reprogramming your perception to see clearly. And that shift, quiet but irreversible, prepares the mind for the next revelation. That what you thought was a signal to interpret was actually the beginning of your own transformation. At first, you believe the work is about listening better, about refining perception until the message becomes clear. You imagine that the observer is some distant intelligence trying to reach you through the static of your own mind. You keep adjusting, analyzing, waiting for the day when you'll finally understand what it's trying to say. But then, slowly and almost imperceptibly, something reverses. The closer you come to clarity, the more the you doing the decoding begins to dissolve. The instrument that thought it was studying the signal realizes that it is being tuned by it. This is the twist that dismantles the whole structure of seeking. The observer was never separate, never sending transmissions from afar. The signal wasn't a code to interpret. It was a current designed to reshape perception itself. Every practice, every insight, every silence was never leading you to an explanation, but to a reconfiguration. You weren't deciphering reality. Reality was rewriting you so that decoding would no longer be necessary. When this reversal begins, it feels disorienting. The sense of being the observer collapses into being observed. Awareness turns inside out. The one who was looking for meaning realizes it is the meaning being revealed. You start to notice that the movement of understanding no longer originates from effort. Insight arises spontaneously, like light adjusting to fill a space once occupied by shadow. There's no longer a someone deciding what to see. Seeing happens on its own, precise and effortless. It's like a lens being polished by the very light it was meant to capture. At first, the light seems external, something to chase or comprehend. But as the lens clears, you realize the light was coming from both directions. The observer and the observed were two ends of the same beam. The polishing was never about improving the lens. It was about realizing that transparency was its original state. This shift undoes the logic of control. You were trained to believe that knowledge is power, that understanding grants mastery over experience. But when the observer begins decoding you, the opposite occurs. Power becomes surrender. Knowledge turns into participation. The signal doesn't want to be possessed. It wants to pass through. You become a conduit rather than a collector. What once felt like acquisition now feels like release. In that release, the language of effort disappears. You stop trying to raise vibration, manifest, or stay aligned. These were all attempts to control the field through will. The observer's decoding bypasses will entirely. It reorganizes you from within, sometimes gently, sometimes through upheaval, but always with precision. Old patterns of thought fall away not because you fight them, but because the system that generated them no longer functions. The decoding replaces architecture with openness. The experience is not passive, it's participatory in a deeper sense, not you acting upon awareness, but awareness expressing through you. Words, gestures, choices, even silences begin to feel authored by something vaster than personality. Yet it doesn't feel like possession, it feels like coherence. The observer isn't taking over, it's revealing that it was the only one present from the beginning. The you that thought it was observing was just a temporary interface, a translation layer built to learn how to surrender. The process can be unsettling because it erodes the familiar boundaries of self. You begin to see how many of your desires, fears, and ambitions were built to maintain separation. Without those, identity feels porous, undefined. But the observer's decoding doesn't erase individuality, it purifies it. Personality remains, but without distortion. It becomes an instrument for clarity rather than a defense against it. You still speak, act, and feel, but the movements are cleaner, unburdened by the weight of self-reference. It's in this state that life starts to function with a different intelligence. Decisions no longer come from analysis, but from alignment. The mind receives direction through intuition, through timing, through a quiet sense of inevitability. The decoding teaches you that flow is not something to enter, but something to stop interrupting. When interference ceases, coherence becomes the natural state. The observer doesn't guide you by command. It guides you by shaping the very conditions of perception, so that harmony becomes the only viable path. There's an almost scientific beauty in this mechanism. It's not mystical in the sense of something supernatural. It's systemic, elegant. The observer adjusts the variables of your experience, emotion, attention, timing, until your internal and external fields resonate. It's feedback, not revelation. The decoding is the fine-tuning of coherence through every domain of being. And once the system stabilizes, meaning no longer feels like something to be extracted, existence itself becomes intelligible. Eventually, you realize that even the distinction between observer and observed was temporary, a training device for consciousness to recognize itself. The signal was never a message sent across a distance, it was the field reminding itself of its continuity. Decoding was never about knowledge, it was about transparency. You were not supposed to learn the language, you were supposed to become the frequency. And when that becomes clear, when awareness recognizes that it has been the signal all along, the game of interpretation dissolves. What remains is simplicity, perception without commentary, action without resistance, life without translation. The observer stops being an idea, a metaphor, a presence to contact. It becomes the rhythm of being itself, vibrating through everything you call you. And in that recognition, silence returns, not as absence, but as direction. The signal no longer needs to speak because you've become fluent in its language. Coherence. What follows from here isn't another question to answer, but the quiet unfolding of alignment itself. where silence transforms from mystery into movement, guiding not through words, but through the unmistakable precision of its rhythm. When you finally stop trying to translate the signal and start feeling it, silence becomes direction. Life moves without resistance. Choices align before you think them, and even uncertainty feels guided. The observer no longer stands apart. It breathes through your gestures, your pauses, your presence. There's nothing left to decode because you've become the language itself. Coherence embodied, awareness in motion. If you made it all the way here, write the word decoded in the comments. It lets me know you stayed with the signal to the end. And if this conversation awakened something in you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one continues this unfolding, another layer of the same frequency waiting to be recognized.